The cabin of the Gulfstream G650 was quieter than a library and colder than a crypt, a floating palace of cream leather and polished mahogany cutting through the night sky at 45,000 feet. Nia adjusted the sleeves of her blazer, trying to suppress the shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning and everything to do with the man sitting across the aisle. She had been hired for her hands, for the steady, surgical precision she possessed as one of the world's leading antique art restorers, but right now, those hands were trembling slightly in her lap. She clasped them together, forcing her breathing to even out, staring out the oval window at the infinite darkness. There were no stars, just the blinking red light of the wing tip and the void. When she accepted the contract from K Corp, the sum offered was enough to clear her mother's medical debts and buy a house in the hills, but the NDA she signed was thicker than a novella. They hadn't told her she would be hand-delivering the restored Joseon Dynasty vase to a private buyer in Vancouver. They certainly hadn't told her she would be sharing the flight with the head of the family himself. Min-ho Kwon sat in the single captain's chair, a glass of amber whiskey untouched on the magnetic table before him. He was a study in lethal elegance, wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that fit his broad shoulders as if it had been woven directly onto his skin. His hair was jet black, swept back from a forehead that housed eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the ambient light of the cabin. He hadn't spoken a word to her since boarding in Seoul. He hadn't even looked at her. He was busy reading a dossier, his jaw set tight, the tension in his posture suggesting a coiled spring ready to snap. Two other men, clearly bodyguards, sat in the rear of the cabin, their presence heavy and silent, but Nia's focus kept drifting back to Min-ho. There was a dangerous magnetism to him, a terrifying beauty that made it hard to look away, even though every instinct she had screamed that he was a predator. She knew the rumors, everyone knew the rumors about the Kwon family. They owned shipping lines, hotels, and tech firms, but the foundation of their empire was built on blood and shadow. They were the modern royalty of the underworld, and Min-ho was the crown prince who had recently ascended to the throne. "Stop starring." His voice cut through the hum of the engines, low and smooth like velvet dragged over gravel. He didn't look up from his papers. Nia flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I wasn't starring," she lied, her voice sounding small in the pressurized air. "I was just thinking." Min-ho finally lifted his gaze. When his eyes locked onto hers, Nia felt the air leave her lungs. He studied her with a clinical detachment, taking in her dark skin, the way her braids were pulled back into a practical bun, the nervous energy radiating off her. "Thinking is dangerous, Ms. Banks," he said, closing the folder. "It leads to questions, and on this flight questions are heavier baggage than the cargo." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "You have the item secure." "It's in the shock-proof case, handcuffed to the seat frame as instructed," Nia replied, gesturing to the metal briefcase next to her. "Though I still don't understand why a courier couldn't have done this. I'm a restorer, Mr. Kwon. My job ended when the porcelain was fixed." "A courier can be bought. A courier doesn't know the fragility of what they carry," Min-ho said, standing up. He was taller than he looked while seated, dominating the narrow space of the aisle. He walked toward her and the scent of expensive cologne and tobacco smoke drifted over her. He stopped right beside her seat, looking down. "And the buyer insisted on the artist being present, to verify authenticity." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "But the real reason you are here is that you are invisible, Nia. A woman like you in a world like mine. No one suspects the historian. They only look for the soldiers." Nia frowned, a spark of defiance cutting through her fear. "I'm not invisible." Min-ho's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "For your sake, you better hope you are." Before she could respond, the plane lurched violently. It wasn't the rhythmic bump of turbulence. It was a sickening, lateral slam, as if a giant hand had swatted the aircraft from the side. The whiskey glass slid off the table and shattered. Nia gasped, grabbing the armrests, her knuckles turning white. Min-ho didn't stumble. He widened his stance, his eyes instantly shifting from the bored aristocrat to the alert wolf. He looked toward the cockpit door. "Jun Kai," he barked at the bodyguard in the back. "Check the pilots." The plane dropped. It was a freefall sensation that lifted Nia's stomach into her throat. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the emergency red gloom. Oxygen masks didn't drop. Instead, a siren began to wail, a piercing, mechanical scream. "We lost engines," one of the bodyguards shouted, stumbling as he tried to move forward. "No," Min-ho hissed, grabbing the back of Nia's seat to steady himself as the plane banked hard to the left. "We didn't lose them. They were taken." He looked at Nia, and for the first time she saw something other than cold detachment in his face. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. "Unbuckle that case. Leave it." "What? The vase is worth millions." "Leave it," Min-ho roared, the sound terrifying in the small space. The plane shook violently again, the sound of tearing metal screeching from the tail. The cabin depressurized with a deafening pop. Cold, thin air rushed in, swirling papers and debris into a vortex. Nia felt the pull of the void, her ears popping painfully. She fumbled with her seatbelt, panic seizing her limbs. She couldn't breathe. The roar of the wind was deafening. Min-ho was moving. He ignored his bodyguards who were tumbling toward the rear of the plane as the angle of descent became almost vertical. He lunged for Nia. His hand, large and strong, clamped onto her wrist. "Look at me," he shouted over the chaos. "Nia, look at me." She stared at him, tears streaming horizontally across her face from the G-force. "We are going to crash," he said, his voice strangely steady amidst the apocalypse. "Curl up. Protect your head. Do not let go of me." He didn't return to his seat. He didn't try to save himself. He threw himself over her, using his body as a human shield, pinning her into the leather bucket seat. She could feel the hard muscle of his chest against her shoulder, the frantic beat of his heart against her own. He jammed his legs against the seat in front, bracing them into a rigid structure. "Why?" she sobbed into his suit jacket. "Because you're innocent," he whispered, or maybe she just imagined it over the screaming wind. The descent was an eternity of terror. Nia saw the ground rushing up through the window, a blur of white snow and jagged black trees. The mountain range loomed like the teeth of a monster. She squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of her mother. She thought of the painting she hadn't finished. She felt Min-ho's grip tighten, his hand cradling the back of her head, pressing her face into his chest. Then the world ended. The impact was a series of concussive blows that shattered reality. First came the crunch of the undercarriage shearing off the treetops, a sound like bones snapping. Then the scream of metal tearing apart as the wings were ripped away. The fuselage slammed into the mountainside, sliding, tumbling, and breaking. Nia felt herself being tossed like a rag doll, held in place only by the seatbelt and the crushing weight of Min-ho's body. Heat, cold, noise, silence. Everything happened at once. A ball of fire erupted from the rear of the plane, illuminating the snow, but the front section where they were tore free, skidding across the ice, spinning wildly before slamming into a dense cluster of pines. Then there was nothing. Nia woke to the stinging sensation of freezing air biting her skin. Her vision was blurry, a kaleidoscope of gray and white. There was a high-pitched ringing in her ears that drowned out all other sound. She tried to move, but her body felt like it was made of lead. Pain radiated from her ribs, sharp and hot. She blinked, forcing her eyes to focus. She was still strapped in her seat, but the seat was no longer vertical. It was tilted at a 45-degree angle. The roof of the cabin was gone, peeled back like the lid of a sardine can, revealing a sky thick with falling snow. "Mr. Kwon," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. There was a weight on her lap. She looked down. Min-ho was slumped over her, unconscious. Blood matted the hair on the side of his head, dark and stark against his pale skin and the white snow dusting his shoulders. His suit was torn and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Min-ho. Panic surged through her, cutting through the shock. She struggled to pull her arm free, reaching out to touch his neck. His skin was ice cold, but under her fingertips she felt a pulse. It was weak and thready, but it was there. Nia looked around. The front section of the fuselage was a wreck of twisted metal and shattered glass, resting on a steep, snowy incline. The back half of the plane was nowhere to be seen, likely miles back up the mountain. There was no sign of the pilots or the bodyguards. It was just the two of them, stranded in a white wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. She shivered, her teeth beginning to chatter violently. The cold was aggressive, a physical weight pressing down on her. She knew with a terrifying clarity that the crash hadn't killed them, but the mountain would. She had to get him up. She had to find shelter. "Wake up," she pleaded, shaking Min-ho's good shoulder with her trembling hand. "Please, you have to wake up." Min-ho groaned, a guttural sound of pain. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and hazy. He looked at her, confusion clouding his dark gaze for a second before memory slammed back into him. He grimaced, trying to push himself up, but collapsed back against her with a sharp intake of breath. "Leg," he gritted out, his voice strained. "Trapped." Nia looked down. A piece of the fuselage paneling had buckled inward, pinning Min-ho's right leg against the side of her seat. He wasn't just unconscious, he was pinned. And the smell of aviation fuel was beginning to drift through the crisp, snowy air. I can't move it," Nia said, tears freezing on her cheeks. "It's metal." Min-ho looked at her, his eyes clearing, regaining that terrifying intensity. "You have to," he said, grabbing her collar with his good hand, pulling her face close to his. "Listen to me. The fuel is leaking. If a spark hits, we burn. You have to get out." "I'm not leaving you," Nia shouted, surprised by her own ferocity. "Don't be stupid," Min-ho snarled, though his face was pale as death. "You're a civilian. Go." "I'm not leaving you to die alone in the snow." Nia unbuckled her seatbelt, sliding out from under him. She fell onto the slanted floor, the snow crunching under her dress shoes. She ignored the freezing cold soaking into her thin clothes. She scrambled to the side, assessing the metal plate crushing his leg. It was heavy, jagged, part of the overhead bin structure that had collapsed. "Nia, go," Min-ho commanded, but his voice was weaker. She looked around frantically for a lever, a bar, anything. Her eyes landed on a strut from one of the broken seats. It was a long piece of steel. She grabbed it, her hands numb, and wedged it under the buckled panel. "On three," she screamed, the adrenaline flooding her system. "I'm going to pry it up. You pull your leg out. 1, 2, 3. She threw her entire body weight onto the makeshift lever. She screamed with the effort, her muscles burning. The metal groaned, screeching against metal. It lifted just an inch. Min-ho roared in agony as he yanked his leg free, tumbling sideways onto the snowy floor of the wreck. Nia dropped the bar, the panel slamming back down with a deafening clang. She fell to her knees beside him. His leg was a mess, the pant leg torn, blood soaking the fabric, but it was still attached. "We have to move," Min-ho gasped, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "Now." He tried to stand, but his leg collapsed. Nia grabbed him, wrapping her arm around his waist, pulling his good arm over her shoulder. He was heavy, a wall of muscle and dead weight, but fear gave her strength she didn't know she had. They stumbled out of the shattered fuselage, stepping into the knee-deep snow. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at Nia's blazer. They made it perhaps 50 yards toward the tree line when the explosion happened. The fumes ignited. A blast of heat hit their backs, throwing them face first into the snow. Nia covered her head as the wreckage of the Gulf Stream turned into a fireball, lighting up the darkening sky. She lay there for a moment, the heat of the fire warring with the ice of the ground. She turned her head. Min-ho was lying next to her, watching the flames. The orange light danced in his eyes, making him look demonic. He turned to look at her, and the mask was gone. He looked human. He looked terrified, and he looked at her as if she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. "Part 1, he whispered deliriously, before his eyes rolled back and he passed out in the snow. Nia looked at the burning plane, then at the vast, deadly darkness of the forest ahead. They were alive, but the nightmare had just begun. The silence that followed the explosion was heavier than the snow. It was a suffocating, ringing silence that pressed against Nia's eardrums, broken only by the crackle of the dying fuselage fire and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She couldn't just stare at the flames. The heat was deceptive. A few feet away, the ambient temperature was dropping rapidly, plummeting well below zero. If they stayed here, exposed on the mountainside, they would be frozen statues by morning. She looked at Min-ho. The powerful, terrifying man who had commanded the cabin was now a heap of broken lines in the snow. His face was gray, the blood on his temple freezing into a dark crust. Nia forced her numb fingers to move, reaching into his pockets. She felt like a thief, her hands shaking as she patted down his ruined suit. Wallet, phone, shattered screen, dead, a heavy metal cigarette case, and finally a silver Zippo lighter. She clutched the lighter like it was a holy relic. It was the difference between life and death. "I need you to help me," she whispered to his unconscious form, her voice cracking. "Please, Min-ho, you're too heavy." He didn't stir. Nia gritted her teeth. She scanned the wreckage. A piece of the plane's interior paneling, curved and relatively smooth, lay nearby. It wasn't a sled, but it would have to do. With a grunt of exertion that tore at her bruised ribs, she rolled Min-ho onto the plastic shard. He was dense, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She grabbed the front of his coat, twisting the fabric into a handle, and began to pull. Every step was a battle. The snow was thigh-deep in places, hiding roots and rocks that snagged her feet. She dragged him away from the open kill zone of the crash site, heading toward the dense shadow of the tree line. Her lungs burned with the cold air, tasting of iron and smoke. She moved on instinct, driven by a primal refusal to die. She hauled him through the trees for what felt like hours but might have only been 20 minutes, searching for anything that looked like shelter. She found it in the form of a shallow fissure in the rock face, a jagged tear in the mountain that created a small, dry overhang. It wasn't a cave, exactly, just a recessed hollow protected from the biting wind. She dragged Min-ho inside, collapsing next to him, her chest heaving. It was pitch black, save for the faint reflection of the snow outside. "Fire," she muttered, her mind tunneling on the single objective. "Need fire." She left Min-ho and scrambled around the entrance, tearing dead branches from the pine trees. Her hands were losing dexterity, her fingers feeling like thick sausages. She gathered a pile of dry needles and brittle twigs, piling them in the center of the hollow. She flicked the Zippo. The flame sputtered, dancing in the draft. She cupped her hands around it, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. The pine needles caught. A thin wisp of smoke, then a crackle. The orange glow bloomed, illuminating the small stone chamber and Min-ho's pale, sweat-slicked face. Nia crawled back to him. Now that there was light, she could see the damage. His left arm was definitely broken, swollen inside his sleeve. His right leg, the one that had been pinned, was soaked in blood. She had to check it. She pulled a small penknife from her own pocket, a tool of her trade she never traveled without, and sliced open his pant leg. The wound was ugly, a deep gash from the metal, but the cold had slowed the bleeding. It needed to be bound. Without hesitation, Nia unbuttoned her silk blouse, removing it and shivering violently in just her camisole and blazer. She used the knife to shred the blouse into strips. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. She wrapped the wound tightly, tying off the makeshift bandage with trembling hands. As she tightened the knot, Min-ho gasped. His body arched off the ground, a guttural roar of pain tearing from his throat. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. His hands shot out, grabbing Nia by the throat. It wasn't a squeeze of intent. It was a reflex, the reaction of a wounded animal. But his grip was iron. "Min-ho, it's me," Nia choked out, clawing at his hand. "Nia the Restorer." Recognition flooded his eyes slowly, pushing back the haze of agony. He blinked, his chest heaving, and released her instantly. He fell back against the stone, breathing hard. "Nia," he rasped, the name sounding foreign on his tongue. He looked at the fire, then at his leg, then at her. He took in her disheveled state, the missing blouse, the blood on her hands. "You dragged me." "I wasn't going to leave you there," she said, rubbing her throat, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life on the plane." "I saved an asset," he muttered, though the bite was gone from his tone. He tried to sit up and winced, squeezing his eyes shut. "My phone, did you find it?" "It's broken, dead." Min-ho cursed in Korean, a sharp, violent string of words. He leaned his head back against the rock wall, his face glistening with cold sweat. "They will come to check," he said softly. "They won't rely on the crash reports. They will send a team to confirm the kill." Nia froze, feeding a stick into the fire. Who are they?" "The Shadows," Min-ho said, looking at her with a grim intensity. "A rival faction within the syndicate. They've been trying to topple my family for a decade, taking out the head. That's the fastest way." He looked at the entrance of their shelter. "If they see the fire—" "If we don't have the fire, we die of hypothermia in an hour," Nia shot back, her fear turning into defensive anger. "Pick your poison, Mr. Kwon." Min-ho looked at her for a long moment, studying her face in the flickering light. He seemed to be reassessing her, seeing not the timid woman from the jet, but the survivor sitting in the dirt. "Min-ho," he corrected. "Under the circumstances, Mr. Kwon seems ridiculous." He shivered then, a violent tremor that shook his entire frame. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the shock and blood loss were setting in. His lips were turning a faint shade of blue. Nia saw it. She knew the signs. She had grown up in Chicago. She knew what cold did to the body. The fire wasn't enough. Not for him, not in his condition. "You're going into shock," she said, moving closer to him. "I'm fine," he lied, his teeth chattering. "You're not fine, you're freezing to death." Nia looked at him, then at the limited space. She took a deep breath, swallowing her hesitation. This wasn't romance, this was survival physics. "We need to share body heat." Min-ho's dark eyes widened slightly. "Ms. Banks, I hardly think." "Shut up, Min-ho," she said, crawling over to him. "Just shut up and move over." She lay down on the hard ground next to him, between him and the fire. She unbuttoned his ruined suit jacket and pulled it around both of them as best she could. She pressed her back against his chest, pulling his good arm over her waist. The contact was electric, not in a sexual way, but in the sheer shock of heat transfer. He was freezing, his skin clammy. "This is," Min-ho started, his voice barely a whisper against her hair. "Necessary," she finished firmly. "If you die, I'm alone out here, so don't die." He fell silent. Slowly, the violent shivering began to subside. Nia could feel the slow, heavy thud of his heart against her shoulder blade. It was a strange intimacy born of disaster. Here was a man who likely ordered executions before breakfast, a man she should be terrified of, and yet, wrapped together in the dark, he felt incredibly human. "Why didn't you run?" he asked after a long silence. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound. "When the plane crashed, when I was pinned, you could have run. You would have been lighter, faster. You might have made it to a road." "My mother raised me better than that," Nia murmured, watching the flames dance. "And besides, you told me to look at you. You kept me calm. You took the impact from me." She shifted slightly, trying to get comfortable on the rocks. "I pay my debts." Min-ho let out a low sound, almost a laugh. "A restorer with a code of honor. You are a rare thing, Nia." He paused, his grip on her tightening slightly, possessive and protective. "The men who did this, if we survive, I will burn their world down. I will leave nothing but ash." The venom in his voice made Nia shiver, but it also made her feel strangely safe. He was a monster, perhaps, but for tonight, he was her monster. "Rest," she whispered. "I'll keep watch for a while." "No," Min-ho mumbled, his exhaustion finally overtaking his will. "I'll listen. I'm a light sleeper." Within minutes, his breathing deepened. He was out. Nia stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. Every snapping twig, every rustle of snow falling from a branch sounded like footsteps. She replayed his words. "They will send a team to confirm the kill." She wasn't just fighting the elements anymore. She was in a war zone. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Nia dozed intermittently, waking every time Min-ho flinched in his sleep. Sometime deep in the night, she woke to a sound that wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic thumping in the distance, low, mechanical. Nia stiffened, her heart hammering. She carefully extricated herself from Min-ho's grip, creeping toward the mouth of the hollow. She peered out into the snowstorm. The visibility was poor, but she saw lights. Not the flickering of fire, but the piercing white beams of flashlights, moving systematically through the trees near the crash site down the slope. There were 3 of them, moving in a tactical formation, and the sound she heard wasn't a rescue helicopter. It was the low hum of a drone hovering above the treetops. She scrambled back to Min-ho, shaking him awake. This time she didn't have to be gentle. "Min-ho," she hissed into his ear, "wake up now." He was awake instantly, his eyes snapping to hers, clear and alert despite the pain etched on his face. "What is it?" "Lights," she whispered, pointing out the entrance. "Down by the wreck, 3 men, maybe more, and a drone." Min-ho's face hardened into a mask of stone. He sat up, groaning as his leg protested, but he ignored it. He reached for the heavy branch Nia had used to poke the fire. He looked at her, and his eyes were dark pools of apology and resolve. "Kick dirt over the fire," he commanded, his voice barely audible. "Put it out, immediately." "But the cold." "If they have thermal imaging, we are already beacons. If they rely on sight, the fire kills us." He struggled to his knees, using the wall for support. "Nia, listen to me very carefully. You need to go deeper into the woods, hide. Do not come out until it is silent." "I am not leaving you," she insisted, kicking snow over the small fire, plunging them into suffocating darkness. "I can't run," Min-ho hissed, grabbing her wrist in the dark. "I am a stationary target, you are not. If they find me, they find me, but if they find you, they will not be kind. Go." "No," Nia grabbed his arm, pulling it over her shoulder again. "I dragged you here. I can drag you further." "Nia." "Shut up, we move, now." She didn't give him a choice. She hauled him up, and together they stumbled out of the relative safety of the hollow, moving away from the lights, deeper into the black throat of the mountain. They were hunted, injured, and freezing, and the hunters were getting closer. The crunch of snow under heavy boots echoed up the slope, carried by the wind. "Check the heat signature," a voice shouted from below. It was a distorted, mechanical voice. "North Ridge." Min-ho's weight grew heavier on her shoulder. "They know," he whispered. "Run, Nia." "Keep walking," she sobbed quietly, pushing forward. "Just keep walking." The mountain was a living, breathing entity, and it wanted them dead. Nia could feel the malevolence in the wind that whipped her face, stinging like 1,000 icy needles. Her lungs burned with every ragged breath, the cold air tasting of copper and despair. Min-ho was a dead weight against her side, his breathing shallow and hitched. Every step was a negotiation with gravity, a desperate gamble that her boots would find purchase on the slick, hidden ice beneath the powder. Behind them, the forest was alive with the alien sounds of the hunt. The mechanical whir of the drone cutting through the treetops, the crunch of heavy boots, the sweeping arcs of tactical lights slicing through the darkness like lightsabers. "Down," Min-ho rasped, his voice barely audible. He didn't wait for her to agree, he simply collapsed, dragging her with him into the depression of a dried-up creek bed. The snow here was deeper, waist-high, offering a semblance of cover. Nia landed hard, the impact jarring her bruised ribs. She bit her lip to stifle a cry. "Can you move?" she whispered, her hands hovering over his chest. "Quiet," Min-ho hissed. He pressed a finger to her lips, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above them. A low hum grew louder. The drone. It hovered directly overhead, a black arachnid shape against the dark gray sky. Its red eye blinked, scanning for heat signatures. Nia stopped breathing. She pressed herself into the snowbank, trying to merge her body temperature with the ice. Min-ho pulled the lapels of his torn jacket over his face, hiding the heat of his breath. The drone lingered, the sound drilling into Nia's skull. Then, agonizingly slowly, it drifted west. "Thermal," Min-ho whispered the moment the noise faded. "They are tracking our heat. We need cover, thick cover, rock or heavy timber." "There," Nia pointed a trembling finger toward a massive overturned pine tree about 50 yards away. Its root system had been ripped from the earth, creating a cavern of dirt, rock, and tangled roots that formed a natural bunker. "Go," Min-ho commanded. They moved with the desperation of prey. Nia half carried, half dragged him, her muscles screaming in protest. Min-ho's right leg dragged uselessly behind him, leaving a furrow in the snow that was a dead giveaway to anyone tracking them visually. But they had no choice. They scrambled under the overhang of the massive roots, the smell of damp earth and decaying wood filling their noses. It was a tight squeeze, dark and claustrophobic, but the thick canopy of dirt and wood above them would block the thermal sensors. Nia slumped against the dirt wall, her head spinning. She looked at Min-ho. In the gloom, he looked like a broken king. His skin was the color of parchment, his eyes glassy with pain, but his hand was gripping a jagged rock he had picked up from the creek bed. He was ready to kill with a stone if he had to. "We can't keep this up," Nia whispered, tears freezing on her lashes. "You're bleeding through the bandage." "It doesn't matter," Min-ho said, his voice devoid of emotion. He was in combat mode, compartmentalizing the pain, locking it away in a box to be dealt with later or never. "How many did you see?" "3, plus the drone operator, so maybe 4. "A kill team," Min-ho analyzed. "Standard formation. They will sweep the grid when they find the tracks leading here." He looked at the entrance of their small burrow. "They will flush us out." "We need a weapon," Nia said, surprised by her own thought. Min-ho looked at her, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. "Yes, we do," he shifted, groaning as his broken arm hit a root. "Nia, listen to me. I can't fight them like this. Not all of them. I need you to be my hands." "I fix vases, Min-ho. I don't kill people." "Tonight, you do whatever is required to survive," he said, his voice hard, leaving no room for argument. "If a man comes through that opening, I will engage him. You must take his weapon. Do not hesitate. Do not think, just take it." The sound of footsteps crunched nearby, silencing them. It was a heavy, deliberate tread. The beam of a flashlight swept across the snow outside, cutting through the gaps in the roots, illuminating the terror in Nia's eyes. She pressed her hand over her mouth. "I have tracks," a voice said, close, too close. It was a deep American voice. "Blood trail heading into the root system." "Flush it," another voice crackled over a radio. "Frag out." Min-ho's eyes widened. "Grenade," he mouthed. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, surged through Nia. They were going to die in a hole in the ground. "No," Min-ho roared. He didn't wait for the grenade. He did the unthinkable. He launched himself out of the hole, screaming like a demon, using his good leg to propel himself into the open. The mercenary, a hulking figure in white winter camouflage and tactical gear, was caught off guard. He had been preparing to throw a grenade, the pin already pulled. Min-ho slammed into his knees, tackling him into the snow. The grenade flew from the man's hand, landing 10 feet away. "Down," Min-ho shouted, rolling the mercenary on top of him as a shield. Nia dove face first into the dirt of the hole, just as the grenade detonated. Boom! The earth shook. Debris, snow, and shrapnel rained down. The sound was deafening, a physical blow to the head. Nia's ears rang with a high-pitched whine. She scrambled out of the hole, coughing in the smoke. Min-ho and the mercenary were a tangle of limbs in the snow. The mercenary was dazed from the blast but recovered faster. He was huge, easily 250 pounds. He roared, smashing a fist into Min-ho's injured ribs. Min-ho grunted, spitting blood, but he didn't let go. He had his legs wrapped around the man's waist in a guard position, his good arm locking the man's head in a chokehold. But his strength was fading. The mercenary reached for the combat knife strapped to his chest. "Nia," Min-ho choked out. Nia saw the knife. She saw the gleam of the blade in the moonlight. She saw the gun, a suppressed assault rifle, lying in the snow a few feet away. She didn't think. She didn't analyze the history of the object or its provenance. She moved. She grabbed the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, cold and lethal. She didn't know how to shoot it. She didn't know if the safety was on. She turned, swinging the butt of the rifle with all her strength like a baseball bat. Crack! The stock of the rifle connected with the mercenary's temple. The sound was sickening, wet bone on plastic. The man collapsed instantly, falling dead weight onto Min-ho. Min-ho shoved the unconscious body off him, gasping for air. He looked up at Nia. She was standing over him, the rifle clutched in her hands, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with shock. She looked wild, terrifying, and beautiful. "Is he?" Nia whispered. Min-ho checked the man's pulse. Alive, but out. He grabbed the mercenary's knife, and with a swift, brutal motion that made Nia flinch, he ensured the man wouldn't wake up to report their position. Nia looked away, bile rising in her throat. She focused on the snow, on the trees, on anything but the red stain spreading on the white ground. "Nia," Min-ho said. He reached up. "Help me up." She looked back at him. He wasn't judging her. He wasn't celebrating the violence. He was looking at her with a profound, intense gratitude. She reached down, gripping his hand. She pulled him up. "You did good," he said, his voice rough. He took the rifle from her, checking the magazine with a practiced ease, flipping the safety off. He handed it back to her. "Can you shoot?" I went to a range once, for a bachelorette party." "Point and squeeze. It has a holographic sight. Put the red dot on the target," Min-ho instructed. He bent down, wincing, and stripped the dead mercenary of his pistol, his radio, and a small pack of supplies. He tucked the pistol into his waistband. "We have to move. The explosion will bring the others." "Where?" Nia asked, shivering. The reality of what she had just done was crashing down on her, but the cold was a more immediate enemy. "Up," Min-ho pointed. "The explosion will make them think we are pinned down here. They will circle. We need to break the perimeter. We go up the ridge." They moved again, but the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer just prey. They were armed. Nia carried the rifle across her chest, her senses dialed up to a painful degree. Every shadow looked like a man. Every snapping branch sounded like a gunshot. They climbed for 20 minutes, the terrain growing steeper. Min-ho was slowing down. His leg was dragging worse than before. He was losing too much blood. "Min-ho," Nia said, stopping. "Look." Through a break in the trees, illuminated by the faint gray light of the approaching dawn, sat a structure. It was an old logging watchtower perched on a rocky outcropping. It looked abandoned, its windows dark, the wood weathered and gray. But it had walls. It had a roof. "A defensible position," Min-ho muttered, swaying on his feet. "Good." They trudged the last 100 yards, the snow thigh-deep. When they reached the door, it was locked. Min-ho didn't have the energy to kick it. He looked at Nia. She raised the rifle, smashing the butt against the rusted padlock hasp until the wood splintered and gave way. They stumbled inside. The air within was stale and freezing, smelling of dust and mouse droppings, but it was out of the wind. Nia kicked the door shut and shoved a heavy, rotting table against it. Min-ho slid down the wall, collapsing onto the dusty floorboards. The pistol clattered from his hand. His head lolled back. "Min-ho," Nia dropped the rifle and fell to her knees beside him. She touched his face. He was burning up, fever. The infection was setting in or the shock was deepening. "I'm still here," he murmured, his eyes half closed. "Radio." Nia grabbed the mercenary's radio from his pocket. It crackled with static. "Unit 2 report, did you get them?" "Unit 2, the voice was angry. Nia stared at the device. Min-ho watched her, his vision blurring. "Don't answer," he whispered. "I know," Nia said. She turned the volume down until it was silent. She looked around the room. It was sparse. A cot with a moth-eaten mattress, a wood-burning stove in the corner, a cabinet. She went to the cabinet, empty except for a tin of kerosene and some old rags. "We can make a fire in the stove," Nia said, hope flaring in her chest. "The smoke will go up the chimney. They might not see it if the wind disperses it." She worked quickly, driven by the terrified rhythm of Min-ho's breathing. She poured the kerosene on the rags and stuffed them into the iron stove. She lit it with the Zippo. The fire roared to life, containing the light, channeling the heat into the cast iron. She returned to Min-ho. She needed to look at his leg again. She peeled back the blood-soaked bandages. The wound was angry, the edges jagged. It needed stitches. It needed antibiotics. She had neither. "The pack," Min-ho whispered, pointing to the mercenaries' small bag they had taken. "Check it." Nia tore the Velcro open. A flare, a protein bar, a spare magazine, and a small, vacuum-sealed trauma kit. She ripped it open. Gauze, quick clot powder, a tourniquet, a needle and thread. She looked at the needle, then at Min-ho. "You have the hands for it," Min-ho said, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "You restore priceless porcelain. Stitching a thug up should be easy." "You're not a thug," Nia said, her voice trembling as she threaded the needle. "You're a maniac." "Do it," Min-ho braced himself, gripping the leg of the table. "Don't stop no matter what I do." Nia took a deep breath. She had reassembled shattered vases from the Ming dynasty, piecing together fragments of history with microscopic precision. This was just flesh, just skin. She pierced the skin. Min-ho's body went rigid, a hiss of air escaping his teeth. He didn't scream. He squeezed the table leg so hard the wood groaned. Nia worked fast, her hands steadying as she fell into the trance of her work. Stitch, knot, stitch, knot. When she finished, she poured the quick clot powder over the line, sealing it. She wrapped it in fresh gauze. Min-ho was barely conscious, sweat soaking his hair. He reached out, his hand finding hers. His fingers were rough, calloused, wrapping around her slender, blood-stained hand. "Nia," he whispered. "I'm here." "Why?" He struggled with the words. "Why didn't you leave me when the grenade?" "Because," Nia said, leaning her forehead against his hand, exhaustion finally crashing over her. "I don't leave unfinished work." Min-ho's thumb brushed her knuckle. "If we get out of this, I am going to buy you that house in the hills, and I am going to fill it with vases for you to break just so you can fix them." Nia laughed, a watery choked sound. "Deal." Outside, the wind howled, masking the sound of snowmobiles approaching from the valley floor. The hunt wasn't over. They were just in the eye of the storm. The growl of the snowmobiles was a physical vibration that rattled the loose floorboards of the watchtower. Nia froze, the needle and thread still in her hand, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Min-ho. He was already moving, pushing himself up despite the agony that etched deep lines around his mouth. He limped to the window, peering through the grime-streaked glass, the rifle held tight against his shoulder. "4 of them," Min-ho said, his voice calm, devoid of the fever that burned in his skin. 2 on sleds, 2 on foot flanking the ridge. They are closing the net." "Do they know we're inside?" Nia asked, scrambling to stomp out the fire in the stove, plunging the room back into the gray, freezing twilight of pre-dawn. "They suspect the tracks lead here." Min-ho turned to her. He looked exhausted, a man running on fumes and sheer willpower, but his eyes were clear. He handed her the pistol he had taken from the mercenary. It felt heavy and cold in her palm. "Take the safety off. Hold it with 2 hands. If they breach the door, you don't aim for the head. It's too small a target. Aim for the center of the chest. And keep pulling the trigger until they stop moving." Nia stared at the gun, then at him. "I can't." "You can," Min-ho said, stepping closer, cupping her face with one hand. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, leaving a smear of soot. "You dragged a 200-pound man through a blizzard. You cracked a mercenary's skull. You are not a victim, Nia. You are a survivor. Now survive." A voice boomed from a megaphone outside, echoing off the canyon walls. Min-ho Kwon, we know you are in there. There is no extraction team coming. The flight logs were scrubbed. You are a ghost. Min-ho didn't flinch. He positioned himself by the window using the frame for stability. That's Kang, he whispered. The head of the Shadow's enforcement. He enjoys talking. It gives us time. Time for what? Nia asked, crouching behind the overturned table. To change the odds. Min-ho smashed the glass with the barrel of the rifle. The sound of shattering glass was the signal. A hail of bullets tore into the wood of the tower. Splinters exploded inward like shrapnel. Nia screamed, covering her head as the air filled with dust and the deafening thwack-thwack-thwack of impacts. The walls of the old tower were thin, bullets punched through, daylight streaming in through the fresh holes. Min-ho didn't duck. He waited for a lull in the suppressing fire, then leaned out. Bang, bang, two controlled shots. A scream echoed from the ridge. One down, Min-ho grunted, ducking back as a fresh wave of automatic fire chewed up the window frame. 3 to go. They're going to shred the tower, Nia yelled over the noise. They want me dead, but they want to confirm it, Min-ho reloaded, his hands moving with a blur of efficiency. They will try to burn us out. As if on cue, a bottle arced through the air, trailing a rag lit with fire. It smashed against the lower level of the tower. The smell of gasoline wafted up instantly, followed by the crackle of dry, old timber catching fire. Smoke began to curl up through the floorboards. We have to jump, Min-ho said, looking at the rear window that faced the steep drop-off of the ridge. Jump, that's a 30-foot drop into rocks. Into a snow drift, Min-ho corrected, limping toward the back window. It's deep. It will break the fall, mostly. The heat was rising rapidly. The floor beneath them was getting hot. The gunfire had stopped. The mercenaries were waiting for them to roast or run. Go, Min-ho commanded. I'll cover you. Together, Nia coughed, the smoke stinging her eyes. We go together. Min-ho looked at her, and for a split second the mask of the mafia boss slipped completely. He looked at her with a raw, desperate affection. He grabbed her hand, interlacing their fingers. On 3, 1, 2, 3. They launched themselves through the rear window, shattering the remaining glass with their bodies. The cold air rushed up to meet them. For a second they were weightless, suspended in the gray sky. Then gravity took hold. They hit the slope hard. The snow was deep, burying them instantly, but the angle was steep. They didn't stop. They tumbled, rolling uncontrollably down the mountainside. The world became a blur of white and blue. Nia felt rocks bruising her limbs, branches whipping her face. She couldn't tell up from down. She reached out blindly, her fingers brushing Min-ho's coat, then losing him. She came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, slamming into a frozen creek bank. She lay there, gasping for air, spitting out snow. Every inch of her body ached. Min-ho, she screamed, scrambling to her feet. He was 20 feet away, lying face down in the snow. He wasn't moving. Nia ran to him, falling to her knees. She rolled him over. He was conscious, but barely. The fall had reopened his leg wound. Fresh blood was soaking the snow. He groaned, his eyes unfocused. Up, Nia sobbed, grabbing his arm. They're coming, we have to cross the river. The river wasn't fully frozen. In the center, dark, fast-moving water churned between jagged plates of ice. But there was a narrow bridge of ice, a natural dam formed by fallen logs. The sound of snowmobiles revving up on the ridge above cut through the air. They were coming down. Nia hauled Min-ho onto the ice. It was slick and treacherous. He leaned heavily on her, his breathing sounding like a rattle in his chest. Leave me here, he wheezed. You can make it across. I'll hold them off. Shut up, Nia hissed, slipping, catching herself. I am not leaving you. I didn't stitch you up just to let you die on a block of ice. They reached the middle of the river. The ice groaned beneath them, a terrifying, deep cracking sound. Stop, a voice commanded. Nia looked up. Standing on the bank they had just left was a man. He was dressed in pristine white tactical gear, his face uncovered. He had a scar running through his eyebrow and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Kang. He held an assault rifle loosely in one hand. Behind him, two other mercenaries emerged from the trees, weapons raised. "End of the line, boss," Kang called out, his voice carrying easily over the rushing water. Nia froze. They were exposed, standing on unstable ice in the middle of the river. Min-ho straightened up, pushing himself away from Nia slightly. He adjusted his jacket, wiping blood from his lip. Even half dead, standing on cracking ice, he looked regal. "Kang," Min-ho said, his voice surprisingly strong, "you never did know when to fold." "Why fold when I hold all the cards?" Kang stepped onto the edge of the ice. "The syndicate is already restructuring. Your uncle has taken the chair. You are just a loose end." He looked at Nia, his gaze lingering with a predatory amusement. "And the girl, collateral damage. Shame, she's pretty." Min-ho's hand drifted toward the pistol tucked in his waistband, but he knew he was too slow. "Not like this." "Let her go," Min-ho said. "She's a civilian, she knows nothing. This is between us." Kang laughed. "No witnesses, Min-ho, you know the rules." He raised his rifle. Nia felt a strange calm wash over her. It was the clarity of the end. She looked at the rushing black water, then at Min-ho. She stepped in front of him. "Move, Nia," Min-ho growled. "No," she said, staring down the barrel of Kang's gun. "If you kill him, you kill me." "That can be arranged," Kang shrugged. Suddenly, a thunderous crack echoed through the ravine. It wasn't a gunshot. It came from beneath them. The ice bridge, weakened by their weight and the current, gave a mighty groan. Min-ho looked at the ice, then at Nia. A realization flashed in his eyes. A gamble, a suicide play. "Do you trust me?" he whispered in her ear. "Yes," she breathed, not taking her eyes off Kang. "Hold your breath." Min-ho pulled the pistol, but he didn't aim at Kang. He aimed straight down, at the stress fracture in the ice between their feet. Bang! The bullet was the final straw. The ice shattered. The world dropped out from under them. Nia gasped as the freezing water swallowed her whole. The shock was instantaneous, a paralysis that seized her muscles. The current was a beast, grabbing her and dragging her down into the darkness. It was chaos, chunks of ice, bubbles, the roar of the water. She tumbled, hitting rocks, spinning uncontrollably. Her lungs burned. She kicked, trying to find the surface, but the ice sheet above trapped her. Panic flared, bright and hot. Then a hand. Strong, desperate fingers clamped around her wrist. Min-ho. He pulled her. He was swimming with the ferocity of a shark, ignoring his broken arm, ignoring the cold. He dragged her through the black water, guided by some instinct she couldn't fathom. They were swept downstream, away from the shooters, away from the bridge. Her vision was fading. Black spots danced in her eyes. She needed air. She was going to drown. Just as her mouth opened to inhale water, they broke the surface. They gasped, sucking in greedy lungfuls of freezing air. They had washed up into a small alcove where the river bent, shielded by a massive rock overhang. The current eddied here, depositing them onto a bank of sharp gravel. Nia crawled onto the stones, retching water. She collapsed, shivering so violently her teeth threatened to crack. Min-ho dragged himself up beside her. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the stone ceiling of the overhang. They were alive, but they were soaked, freezing, and hidden in a cave at the bottom of a ravine. Min-ho turned his head to look at her. His lips were blue. He reached out, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and brushed wet hair from her face. "Part 4, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rush of the river. "The plunge." Nia laughed, a hysterical, broken sound. She curled into him, seeking any warmth he had left. "You shot the ice," she chattered. "You crazy, magnificent bastard." Min-ho pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like bands of iron. "I wasn't going to let them put a bullet in you," he murmured, his consciousness fading again. "Not you." He pressed his forehead against hers. "Nia, if we freeze here." "We won't," she said fiercely, though she could feel her own limbs going numb. "We didn't come this far to turn into popsicles." But as the adrenaline faded, the cold took over. It was a creeping darkness, softer and more inviting than the violence of the men with guns. Nia felt her eyelids drooping. She listened to Min-ho's heart. It was slow, too slow. Above them, on the ridge, the sound of the snowmobiles faded as the mercenaries moved downstream, searching for bodies. "Min-ho," Nia whispered, "stay with me." "Always," he breathed. And then silence descended on the cave, broken only by the relentless rush of the water and the faint, rhythmic sound of a helicopter growing louder in the distance, approaching not from the mountain, but from the city, from the south. Nia forced her eyes open one last time. Was it the shadows, or was it salvation? She didn't know. All she knew was the weight of the man in her arms, and the terrifying certainty that she had fallen in love with him somewhere between the crash and the river. The roar of the rotors became a physical weight, pressing down on the water, churning the surface of the river into a frenzy of white foam. Nia shielded her eyes against the blinding spotlight that cut through the gloom of the cavern. She was too numb to shiver, her body shutting down, her consciousness flickering like a dying bulb. Min-ho was silent beside her, his head resting on the wet gravel, his hand limp in hers. If these were Kang's men, it was over. There would be no fight left, only the end. A figure descended from the heavens, lowered on a winch cable. The man hit the water with a splash and waded toward them, moving with the urgency of a soldier. He wasn't wearing the white winter camouflage of the mercenaries. He was dressed in black tactical gear, a patch on his shoulder bearing a stylized K. He raised his visor. It was a Korean man, young, with a face etched in panic. "President," the man shouted, his voice cracking. He fell to his knees beside Min-ho, ignoring the freezing water. He pressed 2 fingers to Min-ho's neck, then tapped his headset. "I have him. Vital signs critical but present. I repeat, the package is secure. Prepare for immediate medevac." He looked at Nia. There was recognition in his eyes and something like awe. "Ms. Banks," he said, unclipping a harness from his belt. "My name is Park. I am the head of Mr. Kwon's personal security detail. We are going to get you out." He stopped breathing. Nia whispered, her voice a slur. "Not today," Park said grimly. He worked with efficient speed, strapping Min-ho into the rescue basket that was lowered next. As Min-ho was hoisted up into the swirling snow and noise, Nia felt a part of herself tearing away. Park then turned to her, securing a harness around her torso. "Hold on." The ascent was a blur of wind and blinding lights. Hands pulled her into the warm, sterile belly of the Sikorsky helicopter. Medical personnel were already swarming over Min-ho, cutting away his wet clothes, inserting IV lines, shouting numbers that meant nothing to her. Nia tried to reach for him, but a blanket was wrapped around her, a mask pressed to her face. Warm oxygen flooded her lungs. A medic shone a light in her eyes. "She's hypothermic," a voice said, sounding miles away. "We need to warm her slowly, get the fluids." Nia watched through half-closed lids as they worked on Min-ho. She saw the rhythmic compression of his chest. She saw the defibrillator pads. "Don't you dare," she thought, the darkness closing in. "Don't you dare leave me now." The last thing she heard before the blackness took her completely was the steady, reassuring beep of a heart monitor regaining its rhythm. Waking up was a slow, confused process. It smelled of antiseptic and lilies. Nia opened her eyes to a ceiling that was too high and too white. She blinked, turning her head. She wasn't in a hospital room, or at least not a normal one. It looked more like a 5-star hotel suite converted into an ICU. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a skyline of rain-slicked glass and steel. Vancouver. She tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, stiff. Her ribs were taped, her skin chafed and bruised. "Easy, Ms. Banks." A woman in a sharp navy suit stood up from a chair in the corner. She held a tablet and looked at Nia with a mixture of professional detachment and curiosity. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. Your body needs time to recalibrate." Min-ho, Nia croaked. Her throat felt like she had swallowed glass. Where is he? Mr. Kwon is in a separate facility, the woman said smoothly. He is undergoing surgery for his leg and arm. His condition is stable. I want to see him. That isn't possible right now, the woman said, stepping closer. She placed a glass of water on the bedside table. I am here to discuss the terms of your experience. Your medical bills have been paid. Your mother's debt has been cleared. As per the original contract, an additional sum of $5 million has been deposited into an offshore account in your name. She slid a thick document onto the bed. We just need your signature on this updated non-disclosure agreement. It states that the crash was a mechanical failure. There were no mercenaries. There was no gunfight. Nia stared at the papers. It was the invisible treatment Min-ho had warned her about. They were paying her to disappear, to go back to being the quiet restorer who fixed things and asked no questions. I'm not signing that, Nia said, pushing the papers away. The woman sighed. Ms. Banks, please understand, Mr. Kwon's enemies are complex. For your own safety, you need to be unconnected to him. This is what he wants. I don't care what he wants, Nia said, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. The room spun, but she gripped the mattress until it steadied. I dragged him down a mountain. I shot the ice out from under us. I am not an employee anymore. Take me to him, or I walk out of here and go straight to the press. The woman hesitated, her composure cracking slightly. She tapped her earpiece, listened for a moment, and then nodded. Very well. He anticipated you might be difficult. They moved her by wheelchair through a labyrinth of private corridors. Security was everywhere, men in suits who stood like statues. They arrived at a set of double doors guarded by Park, the man from the helicopter. When he saw Nia, he didn't stop her. He bowed, low and respectful. He is awake, Park said, opening the door. But he is in a bad mood. Nia wheeled herself in. The room was dim, lit only by the city lights outside. Min-ho was lying in a hospital bed, his leg elevated in a complex cast, his arm in a sling. He looked paler than she had ever seen him, shadows etched deep under his eyes. He was staring out the window, watching the rain. You should be resting, he said without turning around. His voice was rough, lacking its usual velvet smoothness. So should you, Nia said, wheeling closer. I heard you tried to pay me off. Min-ho turned his head slowly. When he looked at her, there was a war in his eyes, longing battling with resolve. It's not a payoff, Nia. It's a severance. A golden parachute. I don't need a parachute. I landed in the river, remember. Nia, he said, his voice hardening. Do you have any idea what is happening out there? My uncle is dead. Kang is dead. I ordered the purge from this bed 3 hours ago. The syndicate is in chaos. There will be retaliation. There will be blood. He tried to sit up, wincing. You are a civilian. You restore art. You look for beauty in broken things. My world is just broken. There is no fixing it. You're wrong, Nia said softly. She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked the few steps to his bedside. She sat on the edge of the mattress. You told me on the plane that I was invisible, that I was safe because I didn't matter. She reached out, taking his uninjured hand. But on that mountain I wasn't invisible, and neither were you. You weren't the chairman. You were just a man who didn't want to die alone. Min-ho looked at their joined hands. His thumb brushed against her skin, a reflex he couldn't control. I am trying to save you, Nia, again. I don't need saving, she whispered, leaning in. I need to know if it was real, the things you said in the cave, or was that just the hypothermia talking? Min-ho looked up at her, and the walls he had spent a lifetime building crumbled. He reached up, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her down. It was real, he murmured. It was the only real thing that has ever happened to me. He kissed her then, not with the desperation of the crash, but with a slow, claiming intensity. It tasted of survival. It tasted of a promise. 6 months later. The winding road up the Santa Monica Mountains was steep, hugging the coastline where the ocean met the sky. Nia drove the convertible with the top down, the warm California wind whipping her braids. She checked the GPS. Destination arrived. The gate was massive, iron and wood, blending into the landscape. It opened automatically as her car approached. She drove up the long driveway, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, glass, concrete, and timber, perched on the edge of the canyon with a view that stretched to the horizon. It was beautiful. It was isolated. It was exactly what he had described. Nia parked and walked to the front door. It was unlocked. She stepped into the foyer. The house was silent, filled with the golden light of the setting sun, but it wasn't empty. Everywhere she looked, there were crates, wooden shipping crates, stamped with customs markers from Seoul, Beijing, London, and Cairo. Some were open, revealing straw and packing peanuts. She walked into the massive living room. In the center of the room, sitting on a simple wooden stool, was Min-ho. He was wearing a linen shirt and casual trousers, a cane leaning against his leg. He looked healthier, the color back in his skin, the sharp angles of his face softened slightly by the sunlight. He was holding a vase, a Ming Dynasty blue and white porcelain piece. Or rather, he was holding a hammer. Nia froze. Min-ho. He looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his dark eyes. "You're late," he said. What are you doing?" She gestured to the room full of priceless antiques. "I promised you," he said, standing up. He leaned on the cane for a moment before straightening, finding his balance. A house in the hills, and vases to break. He tapped the Ming vase gently with the hammer. It rang with a clear, bell-like tone. "You're insane," Nia laughed, dropping her bag. "That's a 15th century piece. If you break that, I will kill you myself." "Then fix it," Min-ho challenged, his eyes dancing with mischief. "I have decided that I don't like perfection, Nia. It's boring. I prefer things that have been through the fire, things that have scars." He set the hammer down and walked toward her. His limp was slight, a permanent reminder of the mountain, but he moved with the same predatory grace. He stopped in front of her, taking her face in his hands. "I retired," he said softly. Nia blinked. "What?" "The business. I passed it to a cousin. I kept the legal assets, the shipping, the tech, but the rest, the blood, I left it behind." He rested his forehead against hers. "It turns out I found something I wanted to protect more than the empire." Nia felt tears prick her eyes. "You left the throne." "I found a queen," he whispered. "The kingdom was optional." He kissed her, and for a moment the world narrowed down to the two of them. The restorer and the retired king, standing in a house full of fragile things, ready to build something that would never break. Min-ho pulled back, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, velvet box, but instead of a ring, he pulled out a shard of jagged, white metal. It was a piece of the Gulfstream's fuselage, scorched and bent. He had drilled a hole in it and strung it on a platinum chain. He fastened it around her neck. It felt cool against her skin. "To remind you," he said, "that we survived the fall." Nia held the piece of metal, looking at the man who had burned down his world to be with her. She smiled, pulling him close. "We didn't just survive," she said, looking out at the endless horizon. "We learned how to fly."